Keep your head up, keep your head up, keep your head up. We'll make it through. We'll make it through. Keep your head up, don't let it drop. We'll make it through. And we'll make it through.
Hello, welcome to Heads Up, a show about mental health and wellness. I'm retired school counselor Sue Mullen, and with me today is my co-host, licensed marriage and family therapist Diane Vaccarello. Hello to my friend Diane Vaccarello.
Hello, Sue Mullen.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Did you make it through Thanksgiving?
Made it. Yep, the Monday after.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, here we are, thankful to have had the opportunity, I'm sure,
Yes.
to share the holiday with family and friends. And as you well know, I had a holiday adventure
You really
in that
did.
I was sick on Thanksgiving.
So glad you're better.
But making lemonade out of lemons, it gave me great pause to think about what we were going to do in our wellness series this week.
Oh, wonderful.
So thank you for indulging me. I emailed you, as you well know, and we decided that we were going to sort of kick off the holiday season by talking about spiritual wellness.
Yes. One of the 6 on the wellness wheel. And, you know, it's something that I don't hear that being talked about a lot. And also, I think there is very limited research out there about spirituality and wellness.
One thing, Diane, that struck me as I was, sort of reading around and Googling around, as you probably were too, was the sort of difference between people who describe themselves as being spiritual and people who describe themselves as being religious. So in my reading, what I came across was the common definition of spirituality seemed to center around sort of focusing on your values and your beliefs and how those things bring meaning and purpose to your life.
Yes.
And that might be somewhat different than being religious, which tends to be a person's inclination to ascribe to one set of beliefs.
Right, like something secular or, yes.
Right, beliefs that belong to a particular church, to a particular faith. Why don't we talk more about spirituality? What's your thoughts on that?
It's a really good question. It's something that, I am aware of how little in, for example, my training and education there was anything to do with spirituality, really. I mean, we hit on just about every other subject or topic, but it is interesting that there's an overlap with, for example, it used to be back in earliest ages, there's actually like a connection between mental health and religion and spirituality. There were even health centers, like physicians used to be trained, mental health workers used to be trained through monasteries, like through churches originally. And so there was like a very strong connection there. Over many years, things went a little bit sideways with sort of the treatment or care of mental wellness or mentally ill, and it turned more into like the private sector. Actually, McLean Hospital, that's in Boston, was one of the earliest ones that ever existed, early 1800s, I think. And also Sigmund Freud, psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud was someone who suggested back when he was sort of like presenting his theories and topics that the two should be separated more. And so that's around the time
that's interesting because
is.
Now we tend to look at spirituality as something that we want to integrate
exactly.
more, not separate it out.
He sort of spoke around the idea of histrionic types of natures and how it should be separate. But honestly, I think that it's really important to also be aware, this was interesting. There's little research, but around 2010, there was like a burst of research around spirituality, and some of that indicated that I think there were psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health workers interviewed, like 56% or so had said they've never asked about spirituality when working with someone, even if it's over the course of years and years of treatment. It was never anything that was identified or asked at all. And so I think that's a pretty interesting high number, because it can inform a lot of people's belief systems, not just belief as in faith or spirituality, but belief systems as in cognitive.
Right.
And that's a massive, major part of working with mental health and wellness is cognitive processing, and even CBT, which is called cognitive behavior therapy. It's a very common sort of therapy that's utilized. And to me, I'm thinking, well, if we're asking about cognitions, how can that not be influenced at some level?
Right. Yeah. It provokes some thought for me about the definition of spiritual wellness. Oftentimes when people are looking at spiritual wellness, they talk about a person's worldview.
Exactly.
So this concept that spirituality somehow or another anchors us around the idea that there's something bigger and better than us as individuals. I mean, I think that speaks to that worldview thing.
It definitely does.
When I was reading, I went to the Wellness Institute literature to prep for today, and I was interested in what they had as the goals of spiritual wellness.
Interesting.
Yeah. So according to the Wellness Institute, the goals of spiritual wellness, balance in spiritual wellness, should be to be able to love freely, to show compassion, to forgive others, to experience joy, to seek fulfillment, and to be altruistic. And I read that list and I thought, well, you know what? If I could do all of those things in equal measure, I think I probably would feel pretty spiritually well.
Absolutely, and mentally and emotionally well. How can that be teased apart, right? If somebody is feeling more positive or hopeful, less cynicism or negativity, that all helps with a person's emotional well-being.
Yeah,
for
you
sure.
mentioned research being done into spiritual wellness. I have read a lot about the sort of faith-based connection in healing that a lot of the medical schools, and I'm wondering if it was around that, you mentioned 2010.
Exactly.
I'm wondering if it was around that time period that this body of knowledge came out that said that people who have a faith base, so, and that's an important distinction, because I think that some people can be made uncomfortable by the concept of a faith base.
Right.
But people who have a faith base tend to do better. The outcomes are better.
Absolutely.
Medically, surgically, illness recovery-wise, if that faith base becomes part of the healing.
Absolutely, and you're right on that surge of research has been most recent. Over the course of time, there's been very little, but that sort of surge has to do with mental health and physical health and the outcomes for patients. And so there's a lot of, it makes sense. Some of it is common sense around the idea of feeling maybe like there's a connection or a community, because humans in isolation, not so much, it doesn't work so well. Allowing ourselves to come outside of ourselves and think about something greater than ourselves, just coming outside of ourselves, period, right? There's a lot of research around how that can be beneficial for us, as well as being more introspective. There's a combination there where someone who is more spiritual or thinking about spirituality has some of those thoughts that come inward more and outward more.
So pretty essential to be able to think about somebody other than yourself.
Exactly. and being able to feel like there's a purpose for them, and that they're doing good, that there's care, an ethic of care. All of those things really support greater health and wellness, and is also somewhat contagious, when you're caring about someone. And it's interesting because some of, the, again, common sense kind of linkages are that there's also rules and some structure around religion or spirituality. And some people do better following some sort of structure. And it also makes sense that if there's following rules and structure, they may actually have less negative outcome experiences in their life that would be bringing them down, like depression and things like that, because of being involved in rule breaking, law breaking, things like that will increase their negative experiences in life. And it's just like success breeds success. Well, the opposite is true as well. Once you kind of get in along those lines or that track, there's more of that negative life experiences that are going to lead more towards depression and other ailments, if you think about it.
So what are your thoughts on when you talk about rules? I've heard people describe themselves, really make a point of describing themselves as being spiritual but not religious.
Yes.
And what is your take on that?
Well, so there's an interesting, when we're talking about rules, there in this sort of body of general research, there are some negative connections in some ways with having rules that attribute or increase a person's guilt. Like guilt is not mentally or emotionally a good sort of like thing for us to feel a lot of. We can then have self-judgment, effects on self-esteem going down, like that we're not good enough or not able to adhere to rules. And sometimes I think that people may generally or loosely correlate religion with harder, more steadfast or rigid rules. And perhaps spirituality is something that can be a little bit more fluid and there's some structure but not rules. I guess the distinctive difference a bit with that. And I think it depends on a person's their general belief system and their upbringing, how they were raised. There's a lot of influences. But I think the idea of spirituality being some of what you described is the idea of transcendence, of something bigger than ourselves, of ascribing or reaching towards something that is better for us and better for other people. And so if it's held in that way, I think that that's where some people are sort of like defining that for themselves.
I tend to think of spirituality as being sort of the umbrella, and that regardless of what your particular religion is, we can all be standing under the umbrella of spirituality and not necessarily ascribe to 100% of the belief system of any given religion. Or in fact, one of the things, being tolerant of other people's values and beliefs
and differences
is considered to be pretty inherent in people who are spiritually grounded.
Yes, I would say a major ingredient in that, in fact. And the idea of, if that is sort of belief system wise what a person is subscribing to, in the idea of broad care and concern, love for other people, that's going to bring a person up, that's going to lift them up and give them hope and all of the optimism, things that I think generally are linked to people who are a bit more resilient mental health wise.
Right, so those spokes of altruism, compassion, being able to extend a helping hand to other people. Those are all pretty positive attributes. Would you agree that there is also a great deal of comfort to be found in spirituality? For
sure, and I wonder how much that is linked back to what you were talking about with physical health as well. If a person's psyche and their emotions, their body can be comforted by these belief systems and these thoughts and cognitions, how that will affect the rest of our body system, right? If we can relax, and we've talked a lot about like physical health and body relaxation and things like that, but if you're not sending constant stress signals in addition to what's going on,
Right.
how can that be harmful, right? In fact, I think it's really, there is research showing that people are more resilient physically as well as mentally when they have that kind of belief system.
So it's a bit of a release hatch as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I was always particularly aware of the value system of a student or a family around death and dying.
Absolutely.
You know, different groups, different religions have specific traditions, specific beliefs. And I found it to be exceptionally helpful when working with a student or a family, if I knew what their belief system was, if I knew that they had sort of a religious anchor, you know, regardless of what the particular religion happened to be.
For sure.
Because I found it comforting to people that you could sort of speak their language about what was going to happen
Yes.
in the process of losing someone.
Exactly. And again, that connection with someone in those moments where we can find compassion and support. And it's a very interesting terminology. You know, I feel like it's less distracting when we can connect with someone through a common sort of language or process. As I say that word, I'm sort of reminded about the very original mental hospitals, if you will call them that, were called originally like distraction hospitals or distraction rooms for people who are distracted.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they refer to mental illness as a distraction, and so it was something that always
Well,
stuck
I think
with
you
me.
would agree that mental illness is
It's very distracting.
a critical
Yes,
distraction
it is very,
for.
yes,
Yep.
it is. It distracts from life. It
Yes.
distracts from so much, and so when we think about
distracts and detracts.
detracts, yes. And so that distraction, if we don't need extra distractions, right? Even in the therapeutic process. So it is really important, I feel like, when we can connect and join with an individual or a family, that we don't add to distractions, but in fact we can sort of meet them where they are and support them within the framework that they have. And I think that works so much better to provide healing, health, and support.
Yeah, it's interesting because I can remember as a kid, I was one of 4 growing up, and whenever one of us would be complaining or whining about something, my mother inevitably would fall back to, well, you think you've got troubles? Let me tell you about Alice. Alice has troubles. Alice is dealing with X, Y, and Z, and at the time, you know, we sort of rolled our eyes and looked at each other and said, oh, here she goes again. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized that what I think she was probably trying to do was to say, look at something beyond the end of your nose.
Interesting, yes.
You know,
and perspective.
Yes, yes, but that perspective was always that somebody else had it worse off than we did.
It's actually generally true, right? In a lot of ways, people will say, if you throw everyone's problems into a heap in the middle of the room, you'd likely pull yours back and say, I'll take that one, thanks, you know, as opposed to, not all the time, but generally speaking, there are a lot of significant, layered, complex things that people are dealing with, and when we can have some perspective and have someone encourage us to think outside of ourselves while holding space for our own emotions and things like that, of course, I think it's a really nice blend, you know?
So loving freely, showing compassion, forgiving others. That's a tough one.
Yes.
Forgiving,
we should do a show just on that.
Forgiving others even when you think they're wrong.
They don't deserve it necessarily, yeah.
Experiencing joy, seeking fulfillment, and being altruistic. I mean, obviously, those things in combination would add to the meaning of anyone's life.
Of course.
You know,
yeah.
if you were able to experience something in all of those sort of component areas, I think that would have a positive impact.
Yeah.
You're aware of the work from the Search Institute in Minnesota. When we talk about kids, we talk about how to develop positive assets in them.
Yes.
And one of the assets that is mentioned in the 40 assets that we should be shooting for with kids is the sense that there is something bigger than they are. So how important is it that families sort of incorporate specific activities or specific conversations into their daily routines to kind of drive that home?
I think it's really important. It's important to think about ourselves within larger systems and to teach that to our kids and really in all the interactions that we have, that we are, you know, an individual within a family, within a community, within a world, and to really broaden that and provide exposure and opportunity for kids not to just think about that, but to actually do that. You were talking about worldview earlier, and Carlos Slutsky developed this model of how change occurs, and he identified that it's through changes in structure or hierarchy. In other words, like, you know, some sense of order. So parents having executive sort of organization for their kids, not kids having organization of the household entirely.
Right.
And so he had that as one thing, having that in some sort of order is important, changes in a person's behavior, and then changes in their worldview. And if you can change all three, and oftentimes the work that I do all the time is around addressing those three things, that if you can shift worldview, that's the hardest one.
Yeah, but you know what's interesting to me is that this idea that, I mean, I think that we mistakenly think that it's our worldview that drives our behavior.
Right.
And yet, when you think about the phrase, fake it until you make it,
Yeah.
sometimes if you've got somebody who's in a funk, getting them to behave in a positive way.
Yes. Their behavior.
Yeah, it's not their worldview,
No.
it's the behavior.
Worldview is the hardest one to change, in my opinion. Over the 20 plus years I've been doing this, it's the most important one that at some point shift in order for lasting change to take place. But first order change or brief intermittent change is still valuable, and it helps us practice, right? And so
that's how things become habit.
Exactly. And so that first order change, you can go into any one of those doors to create longer lasting change, but you do need to hit on all three for it to be long lasting.
It's interesting because parents used to ask me all the time, you know, in my career, I dealt with kids that were roughly between the ages of 11 and 14. You know, not always a family's favorite age group.
Exactly, challenging.
And I used to get parents come in all the time and say, you know, what is wrong with my kid? How is it that my child does not know X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
And I would say two things to them. One, moral development is on a continuum.
Yes.
You're not born. You're not born knowing the difference between what your particular family or community determines is right or wrong.
So true.
You're not born that way. Initially, I mean, Lawrence Kohlberg, I'm sure you know who he is, the father of moral development, if you will, in America, used to say that, you know, the first reason that you don't do something is because you don't want to get caught. You're afraid of punishment.
That's the bottom tier, so to speak, or first round.
Yeah, and ultimately what we want to be doing is leading to from I am or I am not going to do something because something bad will happen to me, to I am or I am not going to do something because that's the right thing.
Yes, shifting from external locus of control to internal locus of control is sort of along those similar lines of like first order versus second order change.
And it was always fascinating to me how asking people to think about whether or not they actually have conversation, directed conversation at Well, why do we help our neighbors?
Right.
Why do we belong to a church community?
Right.
Why do we
Subscribe.
give
to
money back? If you're in the line at the bank and the teller gives you too much money, why do we give it back?
Yes.
You know, I think there are so many opportunities that get missed because we don't think about it.
Just so many rich, teachable moments for ourselves as well as others, right? It's unlimited.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, biggest challenges for families facing the holidays?
Yeah, I think it's really holidays, and again, with this theme of spirituality being around even connection, right, with ourselves, with others, with our larger world and greater, larger powers, whatever they may be. I think that is something that we need to really hold space for during the holiday time, is that idea of connection. And that, of course, we need, you know, a balance of self-care and selflessness, but I think that balance is really key to enjoying the holidays and of being able to hold space that's outside of ourselves and honoring, you know, what is important to us. But we have to think about what those things are, and we have to talk about them within our families so that we can actually do them.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm struck by the spirit of generosity that we all have.
Yes.
You know, the days get shorter. They get darker earlier, and we need to be kind and generous towards one another as the darkness comes.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, but the darkness also comes at a time of year that lends itself to giving.
It does, and to rest, right? That's sort of in nature. The leaves, the trees rest, you know, the darker days. Our chickens are resting. They're not laying as many eggs, you know, because the days are shorter, less sun. It's a combination of rest and also continuing to give, you know, and so it's, if we can create some space for both, I think it's important.
I'm fascinated by this aspect of 56% of clinicians not asking at all about what someone's spirituality is anchored on.
It really shocked me, and I think that that's some of it. Like I said, is there's not much research out there, not much being discussed around the connection of these things, but more recently there is. So that's, you know, provides some hopefulness that we can, you know, really see the value in being able to ask questions about a person's worldview, belief system, and spirituality as a part of their whole person.
I think it's a fabulous opportunity for conversation starters.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I mean, you and I have never actually talked. We've talked about a lot of things, and we have never actually talked about our own personal philosophies of spirituality.
Yeah.
And yet, if someone were to ask me if I considered you to be a spiritual person, I would say without a doubt, absolutely. I know that about you. Why I know that about you, I don't know. But so there's something that a person is able to sort of emanate.
Yes, I think there is a sort of emotion that comes outside and beyond just our own internal processing.
Putting their energy into the world.
And is it Maya Angelou who said how it is, it's not about like what a person does for us, but how they make us feel, how we feel with them.
Right.
You know, a person can't make us feel a certain way, but how we feel with them, it stays with us.
I used to say that about teachers all the time.
Oh,
that kids,
for sure.
kids will forget what they learned, but they will never forget how they felt in someone's presence.
They don't. And, you know, you ask someone, you know, that teacher who did that, you know what I mean? They'll remember, and it's almost like imprinted. And so we need to do more of that, right?
Well, I am thankful for the opportunity to get to know you, and I'm thankful for being here with you today.
Likewise.
I encourage all of our viewers to tune in on BCTV. You can get us on demand. You can listen to our podcast. And we'll be back next week with the continuing saga of wellness in our modern world.
6-part series.
6-part series. All right, Diane.
See
it's
you
good
then.
to see you. Happy Thanksgiving.
You gotta keep your head